Tell us about your trip, Ray.
Okay, we are.
Well, live because it's 5:00.
Okay.
Let's start. Yes, thank you, everybody. Okay, I'd like to call the meeting to order at 5:02 p.m. This is a meeting of the San Mateo Union High School District Board of Trustees. Today is March 12th. I will start with the roll call. Trustee Griffin.
Present.
Trustee Chavez.
Present.
Trustee Jacobson is not here yet. Trustee Land.
Present.
And I am present. Tonight, we have a team from Hannah Interpreting as our Spanish interpreters. For those who would like to attend the meeting virtually in Spanish, that option is available. Hannah Interpreting, will you please communicate that for us this evening? Thank you.
Absolutely. In order to provide language access, this meeting will have simultaneous bidirectional interpretation into Spanish and American Sign Language. If you're bilingual, you don't have to click anything. But if you're not bilingual and you're using your laptop, in a few seconds, you'll see an icon shaped like a globe at the bottom of your screen. Click on Language Interpretation and then select English. If you're using your phone or an iPad, then locate the three-dot menu in one of the corners of your device. Click on Language Interpretation and then select English. When you speak, do so at a moderate pace because the interpreters are going to be simultaneously interpreting everything you say. A efectos de proporcionar acceso lingüístico, esta reunión contará con interpretación simultánea bidireccional al español y al lenguaje de señas americano. Si usted es bilingüe, no tiene que presionar nada, pero si usted no es bilingüe y está en su computadora, en unos segundos verá un icono en forma de globo en la parte inferior de su pantalla. Haga clic en Interpretación y después seleccione Español o Spanish. Desde su iPad o su teléfono, busca el menú de 3 puntos o que dice More en una de las esquinas de la pantalla. Haga clic en Interpretación y después seleccione Español o Spanish y después aceptar, finalizar o done. Cuando hable, hágalo en español y las intérpretes estarán simultáneamente interpretando todo lo que usted diga. Gracias. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. If you wish to view closed captions of this meeting, please view the meeting on the SMUHSD Board Meeting YouTube channel. The link to the YouTube channel can be found on our website. You may view the captions in English as we live stream our meeting tonight, and you may view the captions in a variety of other languages if you choose to watch after this meeting has ended. Viewers may request additional accommodations by calling 650-558-2201. For our deaf and hard of hearing community, we have a team from Hannah Interpreting Services, and they will be interpreting our meeting this evening. We would like to ask everyone to remember to speak at a clear and reasonable pace for our interpreters. Thank you. I will now hand it over to Superintendent Booker.
Thank you so much. I want to welcome everyone to our study session on the Brown Act and board meeting procedures. One of the things I really love about study sessions is this is an opportunity where we can all just kind of relax a little bit, let down, learn together, talk together, ask questions together, and it's not as formal as a regularly scheduled board meeting. We talk a lot about professional learning for our educators across the district, and we're committed in this room to professional learning for our Board of Trustees and district leadership and governance team. We all need to continue to learn together. I think it goes without saying, a lot of this information might be, we might already know or have in the back of our heads, but I think it's a good opportunity for us to have a refresher, one, and two, be able to talk about not only what we're learning from our presenter today, but how we might apply it to our board meetings or things we might want to do different, or at the very least, reaffirming the things that we're doing really, really well and we want to continue. Lastly, I think opportunities for board study sessions such as tonight's gives the community an opportunity for those watching at home or in the audience to learn alongside with us. I think there's a large portion of the community that doesn't understand why we have the procedures we have, what are the rules that we have to follow as a governance team, what the Brown Act is, what it allows us to do, but also what it prohibits us to do, all in the best interest of transparency. So with that, I'm going to hand off the meeting and introduce Harold Freeman. He's an attorney that we work with quite a bit from Lozano Smith. And with that, I'm just going to hand it over and welcome you and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Well, I would add to everything you just heard from your superintendent 2 points about what we're doing here. I'm here because I was asked to be here. But for all of you, you actually have board policies that say right in them that the board is supposed to do trainings. It's supposed to do ongoing learning process. So you're complying with your own board policies, which is a good thing. But I'm also reminded of the fact that I'm working with another school district right now where there is a controversy going on. The district shall remain nameless. They're in another part of the state. And the controversy has started focusing in on Brown Act issues. And one of the questions that's been asked of the board members is, when was the last time you received Brown Act training? And they're all scrambling to remember when they were last at CSBA and what presentation did they go to. If you're ever asked that question, you now have a really easy answer. It's today. You're today old, right? That's the way that we're approaching it. One of the things, and again, following up on the superintendent's comments, this can be really informal. Even though I'm wearing a suit, friends joke actually that I was born wearing a suit, so it's not just for you. But as we go along, if you have questions, if you want to challenge anything that you're hearing, if you just want to raise any issues, we can keep this really informal. And my wife will tell you I'll just keep talking until somebody pipes in. So feel free to pipe in because you'll be tired of listening to me after a while. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through some materials on the Brown Act. I will always offer the fact that every time I've ever gone to any program on the Brown Act, there's some nuance I pick up that I didn't know before, and I've been doing this for 30 years. So there's always some little twist. And then the legislature helps us out by every year changing the Brown Act and amending it. So I'll talk about some recent developments in the law on the Brown Act as well. And then we'll finish up talking about the ever scintillating topic of Robert's Rules of Order and the processes that you use for your board meeting. I promise I'll make it more interesting than I made it sound. So with that, I'm going to take this clicker, which I commented actually to Char, looks like a children's toy. I just can't get over the fact that it looks this much. I don't think it's real, but let's see if it actually works. And oh my gosh, it does.
Like a walkie-talkie.
It's exactly. It's the small child walkie-talkie you get in a cereal box. So to start with just talking about the Brown Act, so you have some materials that we gave you, and I want to make you aware of another set of materials that are out there available to you. This is something that I gave you. It's actually, I didn't have enough, so I don't have one, and I didn't give one to Yancey because I didn't want to give one to Yancey, but everybody else has one. It's called the Board Member Toolkit. And what the Board Member Toolkit is a publication that we update every year, and literally we finished our update for 2024 this morning. So these are as hot off the press as they can possibly be. It's a plain English friendly summary of the Brown Act, the Public Records Act, and conflict of interest law. So it's an overview. We like to tell board members, especially if they're newer board members, it's kind of a fun thing to have at a board meeting. So when things are happening, you can be reading them. But if we always say if there's 3 areas we want board members to be aware of, those are the 3 areas of the law that you sort of need to know. So I'm not covering that with you today. I'm just excited to give them to you because it took us until March to get them out this year, but they're here for you. And then the other thing, which I also don't have for you because it's way too big, but this was sent electronically to all of our clients. So they do have it. Look at you. Thank you. Is our Brown Act handbook. And what I always tell people, the best thing about a Brown Act handbook and what's in here is this is the first place to go to answer your questions on the Brown Act, and then call your lawyers if the answer isn't there, because we really tried to lay it all out. So in this is a plain English summary of the Brown Act that includes summary of case law, which is something that's hard for you to get your hands on without having it right there. Then the entire text of the Brown Act. And if you ever want to have a sleepless night, just read it. It takes you about a half hour from cover to cover to read all of the Brown Act. And again, every time I do that, I see some nuance that overall this time I've missed. And then at the end, we've got a bunch of different forms. We've got a cheat sheet for the board president, or whoever is running your board meeting, on what to do if there's a disruption at a board meeting and the steps that you can take. We've got model agendas that you can look to for agenda language. So this is something that goes out to all of our clients. We wanted to make you aware that it exists and your board members have it today, which is excellent. And I may even refer to it here and there. So with all that in mind, I'm going to start talking to you about the Brown Act. And again, please interrupt, ask questions, challenge, question. The first thing is, who is governed by the Brown Act? Well, our state legislature, as you all know, is infinitely wise. So they made this apply to local agencies, but not them. This does not apply to state bodies. It only applies to local agencies. The Bagley-Keene Act, which applies to state agencies, actually is a little bit easier and more straightforward. So good job, legislature, making our life challenging. So this applies to legislative bodies. Legislative bodies is not necessarily just the obvious school boards, city councils, board of supervisors. It also extends to newly elected members of those bodies. And I always want to mention that because it always takes somebody by surprise that as soon as you're elected, which probably means that your election result is certified, you are bound by the restrictions of the Brown Act, even though you're not yet counted as part of the board and you're not yet seated and you're not yet allowed into closed session. So just be aware of that. And the reason that's important will come up later. I promise I'll get to that. And then we're actually going to talk a little bit about committees and other subordinate bodies, because one of the really common mistakes we see is school boards will appoint a committee to go do something without realizing they just created a Brown Act body and don't train that body on what the Brown Act means. And then people inadvertently get into trouble. And I should have said this right up front, so I'll say it now. Almost every Brown Act violation I've ever come across was an accident. It was not people meeting in a dark alley, the dark of night, with the quorum of the board members. Although that happens, it's rare. It's usually somebody doing something completely innocent that turns out not to strictly comply with the Brown Act. So my job is to make you paranoid and to make you think every time before you hit send on your email, every time you're standing in line at the grocery store and see one another, to be thinking about these issues. That's really part of this process. So with that little overview, I'm going to dive into the substance. So here's a really quick refresher on what the Brown Act requires. You see it here, that actions be taken openly. And the Brown Act used to be a little bit more forgiving. It said that you had to make sure that any action items were taken publicly. And it got amended years ago to make clear that it's any discussion of district business, even if actions aren't being taken. So it has to be open in public. Generally speaking, everything's done in open session unless a closed session is specifically permitted. I'm going to talk to you about closed sessions and what's permitted there. Agendas and board items, board packets have to be made available to the public. If somebody's requested getting them in advance, they're entitled to get them in advance. The agenda has to be posted on your website. That's an easy one, and it is. And I'll talk to you more about this one. The vote of each member must be identified. And this is kind of an interesting one because I think it was in 2021, the legislature passed a bill to make that really stand out in the Brown Act, because what was going on is you have 5 board members. There are Brown Act bodies in California that have like 43 members and 27 members, these big, giant committees. And what would happen is they would take a vote and they'd say all in favor, and you'd hear 31 people say aye, all opposed, you'd hear maybe 9 people say nay. And there was no clear record of what happened. So now it is very clear for each action you take, it's very important to identify how people voted to make it very clear. Some public agencies have just gone to roll call voting so that they can just make it clear always. It's not required, but it's something that's obviously allowed. And we'll talk when we get to the rules of order, the Roberts Rules of Order, of ways that you can sort of distinguish that. I had the privilege of working with a school district years ago where, lo and behold, we had a vote. We all thought we knew what the vote was. And then when the minutes came out, somebody said, wait a minute, I thought it was 3-2 the other way, not 3-2 this way. And then they started trying to figure it out. It turned out one board member had voted yes when they meant to vote no because they didn't understand the question. So that was an example of why it's really important to make sure the question is stated clearly, and we'll talk about that, and to really get on the record who voted how. And as you can imagine, with the 3-2 split on that board, it was a very exciting moment with lots of discussion of how to fix that.
So it would be better to do a roll call vote?
It's not required. The only time it's required is if you have somebody participating remotely.
Right.
You're supposed to take votes by roll call. It's really up to you. I think as long as you're being very careful in when the action is taken, when you're coming out of closed session, clearly identifying what the vote in closed session was. We're going to talk about that too. You don't have to do it by a roll call. Again, some agencies have gone to doing everything by roll call just to remove any moment of doubt. but not
Mhm.
required. Certainly something you can think about.
Thank you.
So that's just the world's briefest overview of what we talk about when we talk about the Brown Act. So now we're going to get into all sorts of fun details. So what is a meeting under the Brown Act? You have to agendize all of your meetings and hold them in public. And basically, anytime you have a quorum of your board, and I love 5-member boards because I only have 5 fingers on one hand, so it's easy to count. Every time you have 3 board members, which is a quorum, a majority of your board, talking about school district business, that's a school board meeting. And so strange things that happen, if 3 of you happen to be at the movie theater at the same time and you see each other and you start chatting, is that a board meeting? No. If you start talking about, hey, did you get to see the play at such and such a high school? Is that a discussion of district business? It's a wobbler. If one of you says, did you notice how ratty the curtains were in the theater? I wonder if we can do something about that. Is that a board meeting? The answer is probably yes, because now you're getting into the world of district business. It's really easy accidentally to slip into district business. And we'll talk about this more too. The place where it happens the most is online.
Mhm.
My answer to getting rid of Brown Act violations is to unplug the internet, but I haven't figured out how to yet. So I'm going to give you pointers on how to avoid those sort of inadvertent violations that happen.
Yeah, could you also talk about group text and stuff?
Yeah, it absolutely includes texts, social media, any form of communication, written, oral. It covers everything. It's as broad as it can possibly be. And the other thing, we're not talking about the Public Records Act today, but I always have to add, texts are also subject to the Public Records Act, even if they're on your personal device,
Mhm.
even if they're on your personal accounts,
Mhm.
if they're discussing district-related business. So you have to be very mindful about texts. There was a high-profile case here in the Bay Area at another district that shall remain nameless, but some of you may have read about it, where 3 school board members were texting with a member of of the audience during a school board
Mhm.
meeting. And this, first of all, appearance issues were terrible. There was a lot of accusations that this person in the audience was telling them how to vote. True or
Mm.
not, that's what it sort of looked like. But then the big question became, was that member of the audience sharing with each board member what the other board member was saying?
Mm.
Meaning that during a board meeting, a secret board meeting was also happening. And the answer was no, they weren't sharing what they were saying to the others. But really, should board members be texting during board meetings? That may become public record, that you may get requests for that. It can look bad. I work with some school districts where they just really straightforwardly say, if I have my phone and I'm checking my texts because I have a sick kid at home. They just lay it out there for the record.
Mhm.
The fun part is a lot of the districts I work with have laptops for all the board members in front of them.
Mhm.
And I just sit there watching that thinking, I hope they're not texting each other. Because again, you can have a meeting within a meeting within a meeting. So you got to be
I
careful.
just want for the record to show that texting might work.
Well,
Teachers who are asking questions.
Yeah, texted my.
Microphones.
Oh, my.
Sorry,
No,
just to repeat for the record that I'm texting work people, teachers, because they're asking me questions right now.
And Harold, there are times when my daughter forgets where I am and and she'll keep FaceTiming me. I keep hitting I keep hitting decline and then I'll text her, I'm at my meeting, stop trying to FaceTime me, so if public record with that, I'm fine with that, but I never text. To your point, don't text anybody from the audience or anybody at the dais, It's
So-
gotta be like an emergency situation.
I use my phone to take notes, and I usually have like questions I have for whoever's presenting. Should I disclose that at the beginning of a meeting and say, if anybody has any questions, just to I don't know, to alleviate any issues of transparency or anything? Do you recommend anything like that, or?
Yeah, I mean, you certainly can. The trick to all of this is opening the door to these public records requests and
Mhm.
those kinds of questions. They're going to be public record. And so, because if you're texting about district business or you're emailing about district business, that's all going to be a public record. So nothing wrong with saying that. You can decide as a group, does the board want to have practices of disclosing, if I'm using my phone tonight, here's why I'm using it, or do you want to do it individually? I can tell you if it was me, that's what I would do. I would tell people, you're going to see me typing and this is why I'm typing, just so that everybody knows. And when the person says, I have a sick kid at home or I have a work issue I'm dealing with,
Mhm.
you're also telecasting to everybody. If you make a public records request for that, you're not going to get it because it's not district related business.
Mhm.
It's my family, it's my work. So it's not a bad idea to do a lot of that disclosure. The district that I talked about, where the board members were texting a member of the audience, you can bet that those board members now, if they're using their phone, they disclose exactly what they're doing.
Mhm.
You know, I am using my phone today because I have a sick kid, because, you know, my dog's at the vet, whatever it is they're doing. So
Thank you.
things to think about. And again, my job, I'm a lawyer, is to make you paranoid. It's to make you always think before you're using
Yeah.
these channels of communication, so that the first thing that stops you is you. You know, it's
Mhm.
that first moment of, oh, I don't want to lead to the wrong impression. I don't want to create a problem.
Well, and they're not things that are just necessarily known, right? And so thinking ahead, maybe this is something good to talk to like new board members about, like in the onboarding process, on just like these little like nuanced situations that you wouldn't really think about.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea.
Food
You
for
know,
thought.
most onboarding is, here's what the Brown Act says.
Right,
It's not,
uh-huh.
here's what happens in practice. Here's what happens in reality. Here's what the appearances of it are.
Yeah.
And, you know, at some point I was going to get to this point, so I'll just make it now. Usually when you hear about the Brown Act is when the board makes a decision and somebody's unhappy with the decision.
Mhm.
And so somebody is trying to unravel your decision. One of the first things they'll do is they'll start looking at the Brown Act. And I don't blame them for it, because we represent school districts. We sometimes butt heads with cities. And if I'm butting heads with a city, one of the first things I do is I start watching the tapes of the city
Mhm.
meetings, and I start making public records requests, and I try to find the Brown Act problems, because I want to find a way to force them to unravel something they've done. So this is the ultimate, you accidentally step into one of these Brown Act problems, there's real consequences. You know, it could require the board to retake an action.
Mhm.
It can undo an action you've taken, and we'll talk more about the consequences. So it's this is the, I don't like what the board did, I'm going to find a way to get you. And yes, the Brown Act is an important act, and it guarantees transparency, and it's a wonderful thing. But there are also people that use it, essentially weaponize it, to stop
Mhm.
you from doing the work that you're trying to do. And so that's another reason that we're so careful with this. It's not just that it's the law, it's that we want to get your business done. And doing it within the law is going to avoid it getting undone, essentially.
Mhm. Thank you.
So I talked to you about what meetings are. It's really broad. There are some things that aren't meetings, so we always have to point out what the Brown Act says. And I'm going to go through these bullets, and then I'm going to tell you to disregard the last two, because even though the Brown Act says it's okay, it's a terrible idea. So sometimes the law and reality are not the same. So having an individual contact as a board member with a member of the community, not a Brown Act violation. If that person spoke to another board member, not a Brown Act violation. If they talk to three of you, it's separately, it's not a Brown Act violation, but you can't be using them to communicate with one another. So if you ever have somebody say, oh, you know, I want to talk to you about your thoughts on this issue, fine to talk to them. But if they start saying, and I already talked to Greg and he said, that's the point you tell them, that's for board meetings. I'll find out about that at a board meeting. And you gently discourage people from helping you accidentally walk into a problem. And sometimes you can't help it. You get an email, it says, I talked with these three other board members. That's not in itself a Brown Act violation, because you're a passive recipient of it. But then if you start talking to that person, it's not as passive, and you start having a problem again.
Mhm.
So you can see how you can walk into these problems without even really thinking about it. You're just trying to be helpful and respond to somebody. So individual contacts are okay. Going to public conferences are okay. You can go to the CSBA conference, you can sit together, you can go to dinner together. What you can't do is sit there and discuss district business at that conference. So when you go to dinner, you're talking about, you know, the book you read most recently, or if you've seen a good movie, or how are the pyramids, as opposed to talking about district business.
Mhm.
I always have to point out to people, whenever somebody sees three or more board members sitting together, what do they assume those board members are discussing?
Mhm.
District business,
Mhm.
even if you're not. So there's an appearance issue you always have to think about as well. Famously, this was in the city of Pleasanton many years ago. The city council for decades, every once a month, I think it was the like third Sunday of the month, they all went to breakfast together at Buttercup Pantry in Pleasanton. and they would sit around and they'd have breakfast and they would not discuss city business. This was how's your kids? It was just a connecting with each other. And one day there was a reporter in Buttercup Pantry and saw this going on and went, aha, and took some pictures. And next thing you know, there's a newspaper article about city council meeting at Buttercup Pantry on a Sunday morning. And it was innocent, but after that, they stopped meeting at Buttercup Pantry on Sunday mornings because they just didn't even want the appearance of it. So it's unfortunate, but it's kind of the reality of it under the Brown Act. Board can also go to community meetings or meetings of other public agencies. We've had situations where the city council is holding a meeting on something that affects the school board. A majority of the school board members go, they can sit, they can get up and speak at the microphone as individuals, but they can't sit in the audience and have a conversation with one another. So often what we'll do is have the board sit together, but have one spokesperson, the board president or superintendent. That actually is the one that goes to the microphone to speak. Social gatherings, if you're all at a wedding, a bar mitzvah, a funeral, whatever it is, as long as you're not discussing district business, it's okay. And then the last two, which I put up here, and then I always tell you to please delete from your memory bank. If you have a standing committee that the board has appointed, you can actually go watch the standing committee meeting as long as you don't say anything. You can't be a participant in it. Now, what happens if you appoint a committee and then you show up and you sit there and you watch them? Do you think it's going to have the same, they're going to have the same free flow of information with the board that appointed them sitting there watching? So it's got a real chilling effect. I don't know why the Brown Act says this, and I discourage it, but it's allowed. And then oddly, the Brown Act also says you can go and watch staff meetings of your staff. If you ever want to have the quietest staff meeting in the history of the world, have the board go watch the staff because it's going to shut down a lot of conversation. So again, allowed as long as the board members aren't participating to watch. So just a few things to think about on what's not a meeting.
Thanks. I just have a quick comment to make. I think what you mentioned is absolutely a good point, Harold, is the optics. What are the optics? So when we have 3 or more board members together at an event, whether it's the CSB, San Mateo County School Board Association event, dinner, sometimes 3 or 4 of us, 2 or 3 or 4 of us attend that. I just make sure that we're at different tables. I look around, I just, because we're there and there's a panelist, there's a speaker, and also with the Let's Talk, Superintendent Booker has had a couple of those. So the last one I attended, there were 3 trustees. Trustee Jacobson and I sat at the same table, and then later on I saw Trustee Andrade Zuniga arrive, and I went over to say hello. I didn't say, hey, come sit at our table, because I just thought the optics. So there were other trustees at our table, 2 trustees from Hillsborough, a couple trustees from different school districts, as well as city council members and mayors and whatnot. But I just made sure that, the optics. So it's kind of always on my mind. I've had several trainings, and your firm does an outstanding job, especially you do, Harold. So the optics is important. So when we have those kind of events, I don't think it's wrong to have more than 2 trustees attend those. But since we're sitting at tables with approximately 10 individuals, I just look to make sure that there's not more than 2 board members at one table. Then I'll make sure that I'm sitting at a different table. So that's why I know that you already know the Brown Act. That's why I didn't say, hey, come sit with Trustee Jacobson and myself, because it's just the optics,
Kind of just following along with that. I'm glad you brought Terry, I'm glad you brought up the optics, but one of the things I think we like to do is take pictures, and sometimes it's all of us or 3 of us or 4 of us. And I starting to feel guilty because the optics might be, we're all together and they might suspect that we're talking. So maybe we need to be a little bit more careful about our picture taking.
Yeah, I think the key to all of this is that you're thinking about it.
Yeah.
There's not going to be hard and fast answers, but that it's always at the back of your mind. Because in the example of the sitting at the different tables, let's say 3 of you did sit at the same table totally innocently, and somebody from another school district says, hey, how does your district do X? What did you all do when you had your LCAP presentations? How did you set them up at your board meeting? And you innocently start answering. All of a sudden, you have a majority of your board sitting at a table discussing something that is within the jurisdiction of the district. That's how easy it is to fall into a Brown Act problem. And frankly, it's not what the legislature was worried about. The legislature was worried about the meetings in the shadows in the dark late at night. But the reach extends to all of this, which is just why you have to be careful.
I think I just brought it up, the optics, because we do like to take pictures. And we got to be careful. And, sometimes when it's official, maybe that's one thing. When it's like, you
Mhm.
know, the brown groundbreaking, everybody all together, I think it's fine because
Right.
we're representing, we have the shovels or whatever. But we like to do informal ones, and I'm starting to worry about that just listening to optics.
Yeah, I haven't worried about those optics because sometimes I'll take pictures and it'll be 30 different people and I'll upload 20 photos. So I don't know if I have 3 trustees from the same school district in one photo, but within the 30 photos, if you look at the last event I had, I don't think I had board, I don't, oh, before, okay, well, the last, yeah, yeah. Well, the last 3 events, I don't think I had more than 3 trustees from the same district in the same photo, but if I upload 20 or 30 photos and there's 30 people in those photos, they're all mixed up. I mean, if somebody wants to come to the meeting and hang out to see what we're discussing, they're more than welcome to do that, you know?
Right, right.
Yeah.
Well, and again, the key is just, my job today is to stir the pot. It's to get you thinking about it, right? To just be watching for that. What I want to talk to you about next is where most Brown Act violations happen these days. And again, often inadvertently, which is serial communications. And for years, I always had, when I did this slide, I always had a picture of 2 boxes of cereal talking to each other. And I finally decided I'm going to retire that. So I'm actually quoting something more serious. This is from the Attorney General's Brown Act Handbook, which is a great handbook, which is also outdated by like, I don't know, 19 years. But it's got this great quote in it about a serial meeting is a series of communications, each of which involves less than a quorum of the legislative body, but which taken as a whole involves a majority of the body's members. And to illustrate how this works, and I'm going to take you through this, there's chains and there's hubs. This is all again from the Attorney General, and those of you who've done Brown Act trainings before know those terms. So the chain of communications is basically where board member A says something to board member B, and then board member B goes to board member C. Even though they're not all talking in the same room at the same time, you have now a majority of the board indirectly discussing this item. That's a serial communication. Or you have a hub and spokes. You have board member A talks to board member B, and board member C talks to board member B, and board member D talks to board member C. You're still getting that count on your hand of 5 up to 3, which is where the problem happens. So for years, this was on the books, and really it was inadvertent and little things. And then the internet exploded, and emails exploded, and social media exploded. And all of a sudden we had real serial meeting problems. So my advice to all of you is, if you have anything on your device that says reply all, put a piece of tape over it so you can't see or access it anymore, because that's one of the really common problems, right? Is a board member will share something, or the superintendent will share something with the rest of the board, and another board member replies all, hey, I really like this. I think this is a great idea. You now have a quorum of the board discussing and using, frankly, the superintendent in that example as the unintentional hub of this communication. So you got a problem. And this hits a lot with social media. And you got to be really careful with social media. One of the examples I always use, just because it's a funny example from years ago, was a city decided to have, the city and the school district were fighting. The city decided to have a city hall meeting virtually on social media, where people could come and vent about the school district. And so people came and they vented about the school district, and 3 school board members came and watched. And 2 of them sat and said nothing. And a third put their thoughts defending the district on that social media exchange and signed their name as Fluffy Bunny 22. Fluffy Bunny 22. So 2 board members had no idea when they saw that comment pop up that it was a 3rd board member, that they were reading the information from the 3rd board member. But somebody who was involved in the meeting, in the social media place where they were meeting, recognized that Fluffy Bunny 22 is indeed the 3rd board member and made the connection. You have 3 board members, they're not just sitting there watching, they're actively participating. And of course, then it's in the newspaper and the grand jury is investigating it. And somebody reported it to the district attorney. Pretty innocent stuff, right? But again, you can see how easy it is to make these connections to count up to 5. And when we talk about serial meetings can happen through another person, or they can happen through technology. And that's how it happens so often now, is it's through technology. And in fact, in 2021, the legislature finally weighed in and said, okay, this is the rule for use of social media by board members. This is basically what they say. This is now cooked into the Brown Act. Board members can go on social media. They can answer questions from members of the public, not from each other, but from members of the public. They can share information with the public. And it's okay if another board member sees it. That's not a Brown Act violation because, you know, people are on Facebook, they're on Instagram. These things are going to pop up. You're going to see it. But they cannot use it to discuss business with each other. And with the legislature finally weighed in, and now there's a case on this too. If back in the days of Facebook, remember the thumbs up or the thumbs down? If you have a board member who puts something out on social media and another board member gives it a thumbs up, now we know that that's a Brown Act problem because it's a board member weighing in on, and if it's about gardening, you're okay. If it's about the Giants game, you're okay. If it's about anything having to do with school business, you got a problem. So now think about that, right? Somebody puts out on social media, hey, I was at CSBA and I read this great article about the new math program that they're using in Brooklyn. They put it out on the website. Great, it's on social media. Another board member gives it a thumbs up. According to the law in California now, that's a Brown Act problem.
It's a commenting.
Because it's a commenting. And so, can you read it and say nothing? This now says, yes, you can read it and say nothing. Now you can't use it to, send up smoke signals and let other board members how you're going to know to vote on something. You're not supposed to use it as a subterfuge for all of this. But if you're just putting something out there to members of the public and another board member sees it, that's not an automatic violation, which is good news. You just don't want to comment on it. You don't want to respond to it. So this is where the Brown Act violations that are flying all over now that people are accusing each other of, these are the places that they happen. So with that, I want to move on to talk about, unless there's questions, talk about committees and subcommittees. I always include this in my Brown Act trainings because nobody ever includes this in their Brown Act trainings. And it's another place that problems get created because what the Brown Act says is if the board creates a committee, creates a subordinate body of any sort, an advisory committee, based on a formal governing board action, that is now a Brown Act body. It is now bound by the Brown Act, which means the committee members can't discuss amongst a quorum of themselves outside of a notice meeting. They have to post their agendas. And so what districts do all the time is the board creates a committee. We say nothing to them about the Brown Act. They go off and they violate the Brown Act 50 different ways. And they are now getting themselves in trouble because they haven't had this training. One of the important things is it's the formal governing board action has been interpreted really broadly. So if the superintendent goes to a board meeting and says, I'm thinking of appointing a committee on budget preparedness for the future, whatever the topic is, does that sound good to the board? And all the board members go, no formal vote, nothing. That in itself is probably a board created committee. It's different than if the superintendent says as an information item to the board so that the board knows I am forming this committee. Not looking for approval or disagreement or agreement. I'm going to do this. So there's certain committees that are automatically going to fall within the world of the Brown Act. Your Citizens Bond Oversight Committee. By law, the board has to appoint the committee members. If you have a 7-Eleven committee for disposal of surplus property, which you've done before, you, again, by law, have to have a board-appointed committee. Those bodies become Brown Act bodies. And I wanted to emphasize that because I work with a lot of districts where the boards get very committee happy. Let's form a committee on this. If a board member says, let's form a committee on this, and the superintendent goes off and does that, somebody can still argue that that was at the direction of the board. So you really have to be mindful about that. And the other thing you have to be mindful about is what a lot of districts do as a practice is they'll say, okay, we have a committee, a wellness committee. We have this committee, we have that committee. Terry, you're going to be on the wellness committee, and you're going to be, Greg, on this committee. And you lay out all of these different people on the committees. The next thing you know, you have committees that have an appointed board member who's a member of the committee can start drifting into the world of being a Brown Act body. So what we always say is don't appoint those board members as committee members, appoint them as liaisons from the board to sit with the committee. They don't vote with the committee. They're there for their meetings. And we draw that distinction just to avoid, again, creating more Brown Act problems than we have to have. There are exceptions. I always like to tell you about the exceptions. So you do not have to have Brown Act compliance if you have a committee that consists of all of the following, and it's got to be all of the following. The first is it's not a decision-making body. They only give advice that comes back to the board. The board remains the decision-making entity. The second is it is composed solely of less than a quorum of the board. So that means 2 members, right? 3 gets you to a quorum. So 2 members of the board. It has to be composed solely of 2 members of the board. So if the committee is 2 members of the board and Yancey, or 2 members of the board and Kirk, that is not fitting within this definition of what's exempt. Now, you can have a committee of 2 people that Yancey serves as the staff for and meets with them always and is not appointed as a committee member. So that's that fine distinction. Third thing is they have to have no ongoing subject matter jurisdiction. What does that mean? It means that you can't have them appointed and be meeting year after year after year after year. That they clearly are going to have an ongoing responsibility. This is really intended for short-term. You're going to meet 3 or 4 times. You're going to come back with a recommendation to the board. And so I work with districts that say, oh, it's an advisory subcommittee of the board. And I say, well, how many years has this been going on? 27 years. And does the membership ever change? No. That doesn't sound like this ad hoc advisory committee that's exempt. And then the last thing is that the committee, the subcommittee, has to choose its own schedule. It can't be set by the board. The board can't say you're going to meet 12 times on the 3rd Thursday of each month and then come back to us. So very narrowly, if you meet all of those criteria, you're not a Brown Act body. And there's a famous case about this where 2 city council members said they received an environmental impact report to review, and it was hundreds and hundreds of pages long. And the 2 city council members said, well, we volunteer to go read it and we'll come back and report to the board. And somebody immediately said, aha, Brown Act violation, because it took them 3 months to read it and they met over and over again. And the court said, no, they read it. They met on their own schedule. When they were done, they reported to the board what they found, and then they were done. And they made no decisions about it. So that's a good example of where you can have one of these subcommittees.
So this is also where it gets confusing for folks that have been on commissions and boards that don't have, authority to make any decisions, although they advise to the, say, board of supervisors or council or whatever. So it's maybe this too, like we should maybe add something like this to our onboarding in case people just don't know. It does get confusing.
So, yeah, I'm going to use a different example from a different district, not ours. There's another district around here that has a lot of subcommittees, but they're like parent community with board members, like a curriculum committee, that sort of thing. Are those, because they're, and the way it's told is like, it's going to do the master plan for EL, or if it's the EL committee, or it's, the LCAP committee, that's going to be the determiner of things. If they have board members on there, is that a violation of the Brown Act, or is that clearly a advisory committee?
Well, I'm going to give you a lawyer answer, which is
I want a lawyer answer.
It depends. So if those board members are there at the behest of the board, if the board says you are going to go sit with on the LCAP committee, that is a potential problem.
Yeah, like that's your committee that you have to go to.
Right.
Yeah.
As opposed to you're the
I wanna
liaison
join.
that's going to be there watching their meetings and sharing what comes from the board without being on the committee. That's the distinction we draw. And there's not a lot of law on this. So that's where we carved that line.
Okay.
So, we work with one district that literally just went through their whole list of, okay, you are on X committee. Okay, officially now you're off that committee, you're a liaison to that committee. And they just went through and they changed all the verbiage and reassigned them. That arguably takes care of it because
Okay.
they're no longer appointed to be on the committee. They're appointed to be the board's liaison. They're there in their board role. So anyway, I wanted to spend a little time on that because always when I do these, I'm trying to focus on where I see people stub their toes.
What if they're
Mhm.
decision-making bodies, like, hey, this is what we decided is going to go in this plan.
Mhm.
What about that?
When you say it's decided, so that's the
This is
final
what-
decision.
This
and
is what we're going to have the board do,
if they are making a decision for the board
or for
then-
the district. Let's
or
just
for
say
the district, It's really clear when you look at all of the law on this, on the Brown Act, it's got to be an advisory body. And if it's not an advisory body, if they actually have jurisdiction over something, they're going to make a final decision, you can start drifting into the Brown Act problem again.
That's important for me. Thank you.
So
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
a good question.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, I had just a couple of comments. So in 2017, I was on my first 7-Eleven advisory committee for San Bruno Park. And that's where I really learned what the Brown Act was. And I felt like we were being sequestered as if we were part of a jury, because they really honed in on the fact that there's 11 of us in the committee and you can talk to one other person, but you can't talk to anybody else about that same item, because we are making a decision. We're making a recommendation to the board, what 2 school sites that we feel are best suited for, not for sale or lease, what is it? Surplus, to deem them as surplus. So that's a heavy decision.
Mhm.
And so that's where it was, we spent a lot of time discussing that at the beginning of our role.
Yeah.
And then also I was going to mention something about, the 2 years prior to, joining, this board for San Mateo Union High School District, I was on the Cappuccino High School School Site Council as a parent. Then immediately when I became, became elected, they call it elected in lieu of election. How's it, Harold? When you run unopposed, you're elected
Oh,
in
yeah.
lieu of, yeah.
Yeah.
So immediately when that happened, it was told, and rightly so, that I can still attend the school site council meetings, but I'm no longer a voting member because we're making recommendations. The school site council makes the recommendation for the LCAP and the school site SIPSA, right? So if we're going to make if the school site council is making a recommendation to the school board, you can't be on that team that's making the recommendation. You can be part of the meeting and observe, but you're not a voting member anymore, because I'm going to be over here approving that SIPSA. So that makes sense. So that's part of the Brown Act as well. You can't be part of the group that makes that decision. Just like I'm currently on the committee for the Citizens Oversight Committee. I'm like a liaison, but I don't all the parents and the committee members are voting. I'm not voting. I'm sitting there with Yancey like this with a smile, like he has right now.
Well, that's your
that makes sense.
liaison role.
Yeah.
So that makes perfect sense. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on and chat about some basics, which just to knock these out, these are things probably most of you know. The first one is regular board meetings. You have to have 72 hours notice. So when you post your agenda, and the one thing I want to share with this, because again, we look for where people stub toes. If you have a meeting that was not on your schedule of regularly scheduled board meetings, so it's not your typical night, and you decide you're going to have a meeting, but you want to give 72 hours notice because 24 doesn't feel right for that particular one, that does not make it a regular meeting. It actually has to be on your adopted calendar that we meet on this day and this month. And if you want to add another meeting, you've got to add it that way. And the reason that's important is there's certain actions you can only take at a regular board meeting. The most famous of which is you cannot hire a superintendent at a special board meeting. It's got to be at a regular board meeting. So every year we have some school districts somewhere in the state, we represent about 400 school districts, who decides, boy, hiring the superintendent's a big deal. Let's give 72 hours notice of this and we'll call it a regular meeting, but they don't do anything to add it to their regular meeting calendar. It's still a special meeting. And every year we have some district, some poor school district out there that has to throw out the superintendent's contract and re-adopt it. And so that's a good example of why you need to understand, just because you gave 72 hours notice doesn't magically mean it's a regular meeting. It's a regular meeting if it's on your schedule. All other meetings are special meetings. So study sessions are special meetings. Town halls are special meetings. You can call them what you want to call them. They all fall within that special meeting requirement. And that's 24-hour notice. And the biggest difference between regular meetings and special meetings is the public comment part, which we'll talk about a little bit. And the bottom line of it is that a regular board meeting, people can speak on whatever they want as long as it's within the subject matter jurisdiction of the school board. At a special board meeting, if you so choose, you can limit comment only to what was on the agenda for that meeting. Makes a huge difference. So today, if there were public comment at the end, we have a public comment session on what happened today. If somebody wants to get up and talk about how much they're displeased with your flag raising procedures, that's not within the topics of that meeting. That would be for a true regular meeting to happen. And then the last kind of meeting is an emergency meeting.
Mm.
And every day, just about, including this morning, I get the question, was it an emergency if? Is it can we call it an emergency meeting because X? This is very narrow. Again, doing this for 30 years, tonight I have another school board that is for only the third time in my career actually having something that is emergency related. Very, very rare that it happens, because what you have to show is that you're facing a work stoppage, a crippling activity, an activity that severely impairs the legislative body. And in those instances, you can give 1 hour notice and meet. Very, very rare. So it's usually when there's been a flood, when there's been a fire, when the district is making decisions about, you just learned that there's asbestos exposed in a building and you have to figure out where you're going to put kids in school the next day. We're talking truly emergencies. And there's even a category of dire emergencies that's talked about in the Brown Act, which is crippling disasters, mass destruction, terroristic threats. I mean, serious stuff. Where you have to meet immediately to figure out how you're going to keep the public safety. So again, these are extremely rare. So we forgot to put this on the agenda, and it's important, is not an emergency. Boy, if we don't do this right now, we have 3 board members who are going to be traveling abroad at the same time. It's going to be really hard to get a quorum together. Is not an emergency. We're talking about floods, famines, fires, people dying, safety issues. So I wanted to emphasize that, to discourage you from thinking you can just do it that easily. Yeah.
Good question. For special meetings which require the 72-hour notice, the board can have a closed session before that. We're not precluded from not having a closed session, right? The only topic that we can't have would be hiring or the superintendent's contract. Is that right? But you can actually, for sure, you can have a special, there's nothing would preclude us from having a closed session before the special board meeting, right?
Or as part of the special meeting, either way, yeah. And special meetings, 24 hours notice, at least 24 hours notice. So yeah, and it's not just the superintendent contract. There are other along the way, Yancy probably can think of some. There's others that come up per code where you can only adopt X kind of resolution at a regular meeting. I used to know them, but they're out there. So, so moving on from that, I want to talk to you a little bit about the agenda and board control of the agenda. And this is a hot topic. I'm getting so many questions about this these days because the public can request that items be added to your board agenda. That is the right of the public under the California Education Code. That is not in the Brown Act. It's in the Education Code. There's no parallel to that for cities, for special districts. It's unique to you school districts. So members of the public can ask to include something on your board agenda if it's within the subject matter jurisdiction of the district. And you see the board bylaw up there, 9322, BP is board policy. So the way that you have it laid out, which is basically a CSBA-based model, is a request from the public can come in. It goes to your board president and your superintendent, who essentially act as your agenda setting team. The board president and the superintendent look at that and make the following determinations. Is it in the subject matter jurisdiction of the district? If it is, really hard to say no to it. If it's not, you don't have to include it. They also get to decide, is this going to be at a regular meeting, a special meeting, open session versus closed session? Is it going to be a discussion item? Is it going to be an action item? You still control your agenda. You get to decide how and when it gets agendized. The members of the public just get to ask for it. And the reason that this comes up is there have been some controversial issues in recent years, as you may be aware, like masking or not masking during COVID. And you would have members of the public asking, at your next board meeting, I demand that you discuss X. And that's not how it works. They get to make the request. It has to be decided if it's in the subject matter jurisdiction of the district and when they're going to do it. And if it's an item that you've already considered before, the superintendent, the board president can say, no, we've already discussed this item. And if we couldn't do that, it meant we would have been discussing nothing but masking and vaccines for 3 years. Because at some point you made a decision and you have to move on. So you have those rules that are available. I put up this question then about what about board member requests for agenda items? And this is a fascinating thing to me. I'm a lawyer, so I'm fascinated by strange little trivial things in the law, which is that in the CSBA-based policy, which you all use, you treat board members differently than other members of the public. which is always an interesting thing since the education code says any member can add this. And now you have a slightly different rule. The good news is the way that you've implemented it here works because you have not given the board member less rights, you've given them more rights. And what I mean by that, there are school districts that have board policies that say if a board member asks to add an item to the agenda, the board can vote on that and vote down adding it to the agenda, which can't be right because the education code says any member of the public can add an item to the agenda. You are members of the public. Just because you're board members, you don't give up that right. What you do in this district, and it's a better practice, is if the superintendent and the board president deny adding something to the agenda, a board member can add that item to the agenda for the whole board to decide if it's going to get added to the agenda. And the thing about this is it's just over one issue. Is it within the subject matter jurisdiction of the district? If a board member asks for an item and it's within the subject matter jurisdiction of the district and it hasn't already been addressed by the board before, you really can't say no to that. It's just an automatic, is it in the jurisdiction or not? Where you get into these interesting debates is what does it mean to be within the subject matter jurisdiction? And there's a great case that illustrated that out of San Jose Unified School District called the Mooney case, which really helped us because here's the fact pattern. A school in that school district had a diversity day, a rainbow day, and they did it at the school site. And there were some people who were offended by this because for whatever reason, there are people out there who don't like diversity. So they showed up at a board meeting and they said, aha, we demand that the board consider this and in the future ban it or whatever they're going to do. And the school board did a very clever thing. The school district, the superintendent, board president said, you know what, that's not within our subject matter jurisdiction because we had nothing to do with this. The school site did that and we give the freedom to the school sites to do that. And this group of parents were not happy, so they sued. And it went to the trial court and the trial court said, yeah, this wasn't in the board's jurisdiction. And then it went to the Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals says not in the district's jurisdiction, which set a roadmap for all the other school districts to deal with these issues sometimes. If somebody's upset about something at a school site that the board did not direct or have control over, it's not necessarily within your subject matter jurisdiction.
Sorry.
No, please.
I have a question. We've had requests from folks in other, I don't know, in other, not necessarily school districts, but like events that happen in the community to put it on our agenda. And we have used discretion on how long our agenda is. Like, you know, there's different things that we look at depending on what we want to add. Now, would that be that because it's, say it is something dealing with youth, but it's not necessarily, it's not anything that we created from our district, things like that. We are okay, right? To say if we said no and then they came back and were upset or whatever, from it could be like any we had a speaker series that an outside group that we created and it wasn't necessarily our school district events, but like things like that.
Yeah, no, that's correct. And
Okay.
you have the ability to say no. The issue that comes up is what a lot of school districts end up doing is the group that comes along does great things for youth. And you say, sure, we'll put it on our agenda, we'll mention it. And then the group that is maybe not the most politically correct group in the world comes along that may not be doing things you want being done with youth. You've opened from a free
Right.
speech standpoint.
Yeah,
you've
that's
opened
another
your forum.
thing.
And how do you tell them it's not within our subject matter jurisdiction when you did it here? And I'm working with another district right now that just decided they're going to stop adopting any Women's Month, Black History Month, any of those months, because they don't want to have somebody come along and say, we want this to be fill in the blank offensive group month, which how do you say that's not within our jurisdiction when you just did this for the others? And they're doing it for two reasons. One is to avoid opening that door, and two is to make their meetings shorter because they're starting to adopt so many proclamations of this month and that month. That's a decision that's up to them. Not all school districts do it that way, but do be aware once you open the forum, it's very hard to close that door again.
Interesting.
That's true, because then one can say, well, how did you pick to choose which proclamations you're going to have? This year, we might have 15 to 20 proclamations, but how do we pick and choose? Because so anybody can come to say, well, why don't you do this one that I'm really passionate about, right? you know.
I'd like to clarify. So, we do adopt a number of proclamations in this district, and the way we decide which ones, they're always following either a state proclamation or a federal proclamation. We don't make up as a district, we think April's going to be whatever month. Like, we don't make it up. So it's either supported by a state proclamation or a federal proclamation. And while we're on that topic, I just want to clarify for the community, why do we do it? Because I've gotten that question quite a bit. Why do you do that? Why did we have a proclamation last month on Women's History Month? And really, the impetus behind it is to tell the community what our values are and what we stand up for. And it's also to send a message to local, state, and federal municipalities or bodies to tell them in an official capacity what we believe in or what we stand for. As they are having to make decisions at the state level or the federal level, those organizations could look back on whether it's school districts or city councils or any of those kinds of legislative bodies and say, hey, we're doing it because 42 Bay Area school districts passed a resolution or a proclamation in support of Women's History Month or whatever it might be. So I want to be real clear to the public. We don't just go and make up these proclamations or resolutions on our own. We actually have really worked hard to avoid that when we've been pressured, something happens out in the community or in the nation or across the world. Hey, school district, you need to take a stand. Oh, hold on a second. Is that within our jurisdiction? And we've been very careful or thoughtful about how we've proceeded.
No, I appreciate that clarification. And what you have not opened the forum completely because you've said it's this type of proclamation we're going to do. And in fact, the other district that's thinking of limiting all of this is talking about if it's a CSBA sponsored proclamation, we'll do it. And if not, we won't. But that's drawing a line. It's letting people know exactly where that comes from.
But also going back to this issue of public requests for agenda items, what you've just described, I've had conversations with Leahy as board president, Trustee Land before as board president around being very thoughtful and careful about opening the door. And, I might consider personally Scouts as a great organization, and they're doing some event over, I don't know, in Half Moon Bay, and they want to promote it at a board meeting. Okay, so let's say we do that. We're going to agendize it and let them come and speak to it. But what about the next group? And who gets to say, maybe I don't like the next group, or we can run into some real problems there. So we've tried to hold a very tight line around outside organizations, as well intended as they may be, all those kinds of things. We've really tried to hold the line on what we're promoting at our school board meetings, because it does open the door, and then we can get accused of discriminative behavior or equity issues or all those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So.
No, and I think that's a good thing to be aware of for when board members are approached in public and somebody says, hey, we put something on there, proclamation, whatever it is, that you have an understanding. We just base that on state and federal proclamations. We don't go further abroad. Now you all have the explanation, and members of the public watching understand it's not that you're being unsupportive of them. It's really not in your subject matter jurisdiction. It's gone beyond that. So next thing I wanted to chat with you about is your agenda. So all items have to appear on your agenda. If you're going to talk about something at a board meeting, it has to be on your agenda. And we'll talk more about this, but when members of the public comment on the general public comment at a regular meeting, there's a reason you can't respond to them, which is it's not on the agenda. You can't have a school board meeting where the public isn't on notice that something's going to be discussed. That's tough for people because they're asking you questions, and they want to hear back from you, and they want to have a dialogue. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But it's important to understand if the item doesn't appear on the agenda, board cannot discuss it at that meeting.
So one of the things that I notice happens is there's a non-agenda item comment, and then a board member talks about it in their public comments section. You know, they have their
Mm.
governing board statement.
Mhm.
Is that allowable or is that a Brown Act violation?
So it depends. If
Smarty.
it really depends on the circumstances, but if it's clearly a response to that and you're now going into the substance of something, that becomes problematic.
Mhm.
If in your board comments you say, we heard a public comment tonight on X and I'd really like to see that come back to the board, or that's an important
different.
issue to me,
Yeah.
I don't think you're having a meeting on that.
Right.
But if you're
To me.
taking a stand in support or rejection of,
It
That's-
becomes, and again, it's one of those things, is that automatically a Brown Act violation? Not necessarily. Can it have an appearance? Can people start raising issues? And when have you gone too far into discussing the substance? And then to make it even worse, if you say, well, I really support what the speaker said, we really should do X. And then another board member says, hey, I agree. And a third one says, I mean, you're starting to have a board meeting without agendizing it.
Mhm.
Which is why board comment, I mean, the best board comments, the ones that make me happiest as a lawyer are, these are the events that I attended in the district. And I was really happy to see this play at this site. And I'm really excited about this new initiative we've got for this, not weighing in with positions on things, because somebody can always argue, even if it's not responding to a speaker, it's just somebody during their statement starts talking about some item of district business, and lo and behold,
Mm.
somebody's going to say, well, we're talking district business, it's not on the agenda. And I would have come to the meeting if I'd known there was a board member that was going to talk about
Yeah.
this. The other thing is that those discussions make your board meetings go longer. And I'm not saying that long meetings should be banned in all cases, but I can also cite you lots of data about what the human mind does after about 10 p.m. And it's not when you make your best decisions.
Yeah.
There's evidence that's been researched on this.
Yeah.
And so anything you can do to keep the meeting flowing and on topic is going to be helpful. I also want to talk to you about exceptions for where you don't have to have an item on the agenda. And I already mentioned the emergency situation that comes up. Subsequent need. I've got a district tonight that's going to have a subsequent need item on their agenda. This is something you don't want to use a lot, but it is available to you, and it's really important to understand it. If something was not on the agenda, that's the first part. The second part is it came to the district's attention after the agenda was posted. Can't be something that you knew earlier. And the third part is that you have to take action on it that night because there's some timeline you're up against. It can't be put off for 2 weeks to another meeting. In those instances, the board by a 2/3 vote can vote right then and there when they adopt the agenda. And I see you're now officially adopting the agenda. That's the moment where you can actually add an item. And yeah.
Does it have to fall under like some kind of emergency? Like, let's use the example of a contract. We found out later that, oh my gosh, we have to have this contract signed by a certain date. We didn't know until after the agenda was posted. That's not necessarily an emergency, but if we don't sign that contract, and I'm making this up, but
Yeah.
if we don't sign that contract, it's going to fall through and won't get the service for students. Does that fall under subsequent need?
Yeah, it can.
Mm.
It can. And that's why it's subsequent need is what we call it. It's not emergency. It's a need arose. And I'll give you a very specific illustration because this happened. There was a school district that had applied for some grant funds and it had to take a board action to get the grant. And it was significant. It was 7 figures, significant grant. The folks dealing with the grant sent the information to the school district to their old district office because they'd moved. And it took a really long time to get to the new district office. And by the time they got it and opened it, it was less than 24 hours before the board meeting. And the deadline was like that Friday and the board meeting was Thursday night. And so they were going to lose over $1 million if they didn't take action then and there. So they made it very clear. They went on the agenda. They explained why they were doing it. They had a 2/3 vote of the board to add it to the item. They took advantage of that. They added it to the agenda. It showed in the minutes. Everything was fine. What isn't a subsequent need is, oh my gosh, we forgot to put this on the agenda. We knew about it and we just forgot to put it on. But there's another trick you can always use, which is if you're more than 24 hours out, you can have a special meeting added and you can have a special meeting right before your regular meeting.
Right.
Or right after your regular meeting. I don't recommend doing that on a regular basis because it gets everybody confused if you keep doing it. But on occasion, we've been able to do it that way. This one's particularly useful when it's less than 24 hours that you learned about it. There's also an exception for held over items. without adding it to the next agenda. You can just say we're holding this item over to the next meeting. I usually say it's better to put it on the agenda for the next meeting anyway, just to make sure of that. And then here's the one that goes back to what we were just talking about. You can make announcements and you can respond to public comments and questions as follows. You can say, thank you. That's a good one. You can say, I'm sorry, I didn't understand your comment. Can you clarify? That's another good one. But saying, I agree, I disagree, getting into the substance of public comment, again, at a regular board meeting during the general public comment period, there's very little you can say. One of the other things you're allowed to do is to refer the matter to staff. You can say, thank you, we heard what you're saying. I would like it if staff could come back to us with a report on this. That's allowable, specifically under the Brown Act. But the more you hear yourself talking in response to something somebody said in public comment, the worse things are going. It should be crisp, succinct. And the chief problem that I see that comes up with this is the head of your fundraising foundation or your parent-teacher association gets up and says something, and all the board members comment back, and a dialogue ensues. And then the next person gets up and says something that you're really offended by, and the board members all sit there like this and say nothing. So again, it's a disparate treatment. Why is this person getting to hear from the board and that's not? So you try to keep it equal for everybody. And one of the important things to remember, and this is a quote that comes from CSBA, from NSBA, that we use all the time, a school board meeting is a meeting of the board held in public, not a meeting of the public held in front of the board. And your board bylaw 9320 says this. This is the first thing it says in the bylaw. Meetings of the governing board are conducted for the purpose of accomplishing district business. It is not for the purpose of public input. It is for the purpose of you doing your business. You're doing it publicly. You're listening to public input. You're taking it into consideration. But the primary purpose of your meeting is not for the public to have a town hall. And that's really hard for people to understand. And the reason why is because you only meet, 2 times a month. You have a lot of business you need to take care of. I talked to my dad, was a chairman of the board of a multinational corporation, and I've talked to him about the Brown Act and what school boards do. And he said, if we were only allowed to discuss business for our corporation twice a month, we would have gone out of business in 6 months. You got a lot to do in a short period of time. So you hear a lot of what I'm talking about tonight is using the Brown Act, using meeting procedures to keep things on track, to keep them moving forward, to get your business done. And there are districts around the state, you all know who they are, and I'm not going to tell you, that are famous for meetings that go till 2 in the morning and 4 in the morning and have endless public comment. I'm not naming names. It's hard to get the work of the district done if you're doing that. And again, all this data that shows after about 10 p.m., the quality of the decisions you're making and the dialogue you're having diminishes. I had one situation years ago where a board liked to go really late, hear as much public comment as possible, and the superintendent started replacing their caffeinated coffee with decaffeinated coffee. And then the meeting started ending at 10 or 10:30. Don't make the superintendent do that to you. Try to keep it on track. So a little bit more on public participation. So public comment, we talked about a lot, and I'm not going to belabor it. But one of the things I do want to note when you think about public comment, if somebody is talking about something that is not in your jurisdiction, it's okay to tell them you need to wrap it up because we have no control over that. I always think about the board meeting I went to where somebody stood up and started talking about aliens. And it had nothing to do with anything. They were a big alien buff and they liked being at the microphone. You can cut off the microphone because that is not within your jurisdiction. Yeah, please.
I think you just.
Microphone, sorry.
I think you just answered it. If they're, you can cut them off even before their 3 minutes is up.
If it is not within the subject matter jurisdiction, they have no business speaking there. Now, if they get up and they tie it to, and their people are very creative with the way they tie it to the school district, you're probably going to have to let them have their time unless they become disruptive or threatening. And that's the last thing you see up there. The second bullet, by the way, is just people are allowed to record and photograph during the meeting. So just be aware of that. But with disruptions, there's very specific rules. So if somebody comes on up to the microphone or they're doing it online and they start saying something that is wildly offensive, does that give you a basis to cut them off? And the law on this is super complicated. And I'm going to give you two specific illustrations. City of Santa Cruz, this is a published court case. Somebody got up and started doing a Nazi salute to the city council and accusing them of being Nazis because of a particular decision they made. And the city council pulled the plug, wouldn't let them talk. And a court ruled that they violated the speaker's First Amendment rights because they were talking about city council business. They were just doing it in an offensive way. Another example happened in Albany Unified School District. This is another published opinion where actually president of the teachers union was speaking at the microphone, and to illustrate their point, this is all garbage. He took a garbage can and started throwing garbage around.
I was there.
Were you there?
Yep.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was awesome.
Wow.
It was crazy.
And yes, it was. So the lesson of that story, though, that went to court as well. And the court said that's actually a physical disruption of the meeting. And there's sanitary issues and whatnot. And it was okay to cut the person off. Now, here's the thing that's kind of tricky. I used the Nazi salute as an example. That was a city council meeting. I don't know that it's the same result in a school board meeting. It's untested because you have kids who are watching. You know, it's a different audience. And especially for an elementary school district, I would particularly say at some point you may be able to get there. But the legislature finally tried to give us some clarification in 2022 with the bill SB 1100. What the law had said and still says in the Brown Act before that is if somebody is causing a disruption to the extent that you're not able to continue the meeting, they're chanting, they're not allowing you to go, they're refusing to leave the microphone after 3 minutes, whatever else that it is, you can clear the room. You can say everybody leave other than the media. And if the media is causing the disruption, they have to leave too. And you proceed to have a board meeting with no audience, which is, I've been in one of those before. It's a very weird experience. It's like playing football in an empty stadium. But that's kind of hard, right? Because there's people that are sitting in the audience who are doing nothing and you're asking them to leave because somebody else is causing a disruption. So the legislature in this bill in 2022 said, okay, if an individual or individuals are causing a disruption, you can require them to leave. And they defined in the legislation finally, this is in the Brown Act, what a disruption is. They have to be actually disrupting, disturbing, or impeding or rendering infeasible the orderly conduct of the meeting. Okay? So that means they're shouting you down. I think of another school district in the Bay Area that had people rush the board physically because they were upset about something. They had to put up police barriers in front of them. That's disrupting the meeting. Even then, unless it's a threat of violence, which is the one exception, whenever somebody's actually threatening violence, you can cut them off. You can call the police. That is not protected speech. If you get into one of those situations, you are supposed to warn them at least once. You're supposed to say, please get back on topic. Please don't, you're doing this, you're disrupting the meeting, whatever's happening. If they continue to refuse, you can order them to leave. Now, here's an interesting question for all of you. What happens if they don't leave once you've ordered them to leave? And there's nothing in the Brown Act that addresses this, which is why sometimes you have to call the police. And sometimes the police don't want to come because they will say things like, we're catching real criminals, we're busy. And so talking to your local law enforcement, having an understanding of when they'll come. If you have a really large controversial topic, talking to them about maybe having a police officer present are things to think about. Because it's great, the legislature gave you the solution and then they gave you no way to enforce it. So.
I'm really proud of this board because we had situations like this come up a number of months ago, which I don't think really we haven't had the experience of dealing with in the past, where President Andrade Zuniga had to remove people from the audience. We had to take a break. We've had to have law enforcement here, and doing all of those acts in the moment under duress is it's way easier said than done. The saying of it in a calm space like this, yeah, we'll do this or do that. But in the moment when people are yelling or screaming, red-faced, throwing out obscenities, all those kinds of things, very, very challenging. And I do want to commend this board. They handled it very well. And it was scary and challenging. And we meaning the governing board took it face on and persevered through it. So just a lot of
Mhm.
acknowledgement for our current board on that.
Yeah, well done. Yeah, it's tough. It is tough in those moments. And the thing to be aware of is there are times you have to let somebody say the offensive thing if they haven't gone over the edge. And then you have to make the decision in that moment, has this gone over the edge? Has this gone too far? I work with one school district, and now a number have followed the model where they had one speaker who kept coming to meetings and always said things that were really offensive, but said them very carefully couched within the subject matter jurisdiction of the district. And they didn't use foul language. There were just some philosophies the person had that were not, say, popular. And so what they ended up doing, instead of, because they came to me, how do we cut this person off? I said, I don't know that you can. But what they did do is they adopted a statement that they read before every public comment that says speakers are permitted to speak within things within the subject matter jurisdiction of the district. The speakers don't necessarily reflect the views and values of the district. They have a free speech right to be able to do this. And they made a pretty strong statement, and it changed the demeanor of the meetings because people kept, why are you letting this person speak? We just said right up front, legally, we have to let this person speak. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we agree with anything that they say.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you send us that
Yeah.
language? I'd like
Yeah,
to
that's
see
a good
that.
idea. There was a situation we had where somebody was criticizing one of our staff members for what they named their children. So I cut them off. And I guess, I was really disgusted, but it's intimidating because you don't know if it's freedom of speech or not. So in that situation, were we in the right? It wasn't in the jurisdiction of our district. Okay.
Yeah, and the best thing to do is to make clear to somebody, I'm not cutting you off because of the content of what you're saying or because of, whatever else. That we have no jurisdiction over what somebody names their child. This has nothing to do
Right.
with
Mhm.
anything this board has jurisdiction over. And repeating that message to make clear, this is not based on, I don't like what you're saying. This is based on, this isn't within our jurisdiction. And then doing that consistently. So when
Yeah.
somebody else gets up and speaks, and again, it's the PTA president gets up and speaks and they're really excited because there was some big landmark decision that they're excited about that has nothing to do with you. You have to equally tell them that's not within the jurisdiction of the board. So we're not
Mhm.
taking public comment on it. But in that instance, yeah, I think it was right to cut it off. The best thing to do is cut it off with the explanation.
Okay,
It's because we have no jurisdiction over this issue.
thank you.
And I will get you that language. Like I said, a few districts have adopted different versions of it now. So on public comment, just to remind you, you're allowed to limit the length of public comment. You have a board bylaw that limits individual speakers to 3 minutes, and the board president has authority to shorten that even further if you have a lot of people who are going to speak. But did you all know that your board bylaw, and this is based on CSBA's model, actually says that the total time limit that you will have, not may have, but will have on each item for public comment is 20 minutes maximum. Almost every school district has that, and almost none of them actually enforce it. Some do. But you can limit it to 20 minutes total. And then again, in the discretion of the board president, they can decide to extend that time period. So if you
Yeah.
have something with 100 speakers, you can actually tell them, we're going to take 20 minutes. There's the other things you can do though, like we're going to randomly take and order different speakers. Some districts, it's more typical for city where they will actually have you on your speaker card check, I'm for or against this item. And they'll put them in separate piles and they'll take one from one and one from the other to balance it out.
Mhm,
School
mhm.
districts, it's a little harder because they're not always pro and con kinds of
Mhm.
issues. So you see that less. But what you can do is say, and the Brown Act says this, we're only going to take 20 minutes of speakers, but when we're done, we're going to take a poll. So, for those who are in favor of this resolution, raise your hand. For those who are going to speak tonight against it, raise your hand. So at least you get a sense because sometimes the first 20 minutes of speakers randomly all happen to be on one side. And then it
That's
turns out that the majority of the audience is on a different side. So up to you whether you want to enforce that or not. It does make a difference in the length of your meetings. Yeah.
Would you have to state that up front, or can you just kind of make that decision after it gets rolling and you kind of see that, oh, this is gonna be longer than 20 minutes?
Yeah, it's often done exactly that way on the rolling basis where the board president realizes we're 15 minutes in and we still have 30 speaker cards.
Mhm,
And you just say, we do have a board policy that allows us to stop comments at 20 minutes. So,
mhm.
we have 3 more speakers that's going to fill in, or 2 more speakers will get us to the 20-minute mark. And then if you want to take that poll of folks at the end of that.
Okay, and then along with that so 20 minutes per item. Does that mean agendized item or just topic in general? Because how do you know if everybody in the audience that's here is going to be talking about that item? Do you take a poll of what are you going to talk about?
Well, hopefully, I'm guessing you have a speaker card system in place. where
Yeah.
People are
And it's
And
denoting.
it's usually
are you
not
gonna
on
speak on.
agenda.
Where
Yeah.
it's challenging is the Zoom, doing it over Zoom, because there's no indication of what with which they're going to speak.
Mhm.
I also want to recognize how challenging it is during tense moments with lots of people in the audience to all of a sudden say, we're done. 20 minutes is up. There's this notion of crowd control and responding to your community and being good listeners and the political nature of all of that. We've been faced with that when Trustee Land was president, when in your presidency, reading the room and cutting it off after 20 minutes when
Yeah.
you got all those people in here. That can be challenging.
Yeah.
So I would recommend not cutting it off as it's rolling, but recognizing the room right away and say, if you're going to do that, saying,
Mhm.
listen, we've got a full agenda tonight. I know there are many of you here that want to speak on this issue. We're going to limit on this particular topic to 20 minutes. If you have more comments to offer, please email the board and the superintendent. We read every single email,
Mhm.
so on and so forth. But to cut it off in that you can be accused of you don't like what you're hearing, and that's why you're cutting it off.
We've also started to say, I'll only take the first 20 speakers.
Yeah.
Or, and on Zoom too, the first 5 or whatever. And now, what is the minimum amount of time that we can allow people? Because I've said, okay, there's 30 speakers and there's like 5 minutes, you get a minute each or whatever. But is there a minimum?
It's within your discretion. I've
30
seen
seconds?
boards give 30 seconds so that people get a chance to stand up and say, I'm in favor of this resolution, and then go sit down.
Okay.
But the other thing you can also do is encourage people, if you hear somebody saying what you were going to say,
Right.
acknowledge it. And,
Yeah.
don't applaud, but my favorite thing is the American Sign Language applause.
Uh-huh.
Just signal that you agree with what the person's saying. The board sees it. And sometimes that's enough for people that, okay, I'm not going to get up and repeat what I've already heard. And so that's a more polite way of saying it. If your point's been made, but you're here and you really want to let us know what it is, do this. The other thing is you can always send an email to the board. You can
Mhm.
always send an email, that says, I wasn't able to speak at the meetings, too many speakers, but I wanted to share my thoughts on this topic with the board.
Thank you.
Our board bylaw does mention that, of course, we can adjust the time. I know one time we adjusted that we've had like a certain number of folks. It might have been the meeting, we had like 60 comments. So like the first half of the folks had 3 minutes to comment. And then we said, well, we have a lot more comment cards. And that's when we realized we have a lot of folks with their hands raised online. And so then we scaled back the time. And so I kind of felt like, should we have done that? Was that the right thing to do? Because the half of the folks got to speak for 3 minutes. The second half got to speak for 2 minutes. It does mention here, though, in our board bylaw that to allow for a diverse, to allow for a diverse viewpoint from the public. But folks with the same viewpoint, can select a few individuals, but we never see anybody like coordinate in the audience. Hey, how many people want to have the same viewpoint as me? Let's just have a few people go up to speak. So,
yeah.
And the other thing, so I'm not sure what the answer is to that. If we were in the right to do that, cut halfway through, say now we're only gonna make it 2 minutes, because not halfway through, I think 10 or 12 people had 2 minutes. The majority had 3 minutes, right? 30 plus
Yeah.
people had 3 minutes.
It's okay.
That's okay. Good.
And,
That's good.
So it's okay.
Good.
It is
That's
okay to
good.
do that as long as you're being fair. You're not waiting for a particular person to get up
Yeah.
and pouncing and saying you get to control your meeting. And just like you could say after 20 minutes, we're not taking any other speakers. So at that point, you're totally cutting off
Right.
somebody's
Well,
time.
this was after an hour and a half.
That's
So
okay.
yeah.
But as long as you're doing it even-handedly and you're applying, and you can see this theme through everything we're saying, you always have to do it equally for everybody, whether they're supporters of the district, detractors of the district. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Okay.
And I've seen districts that will actually just say, I'm thinking of one, if it's a really crowded agenda that
Right.
night, they'll say, okay, on this item, we're going to take comments for 3 minutes. If we have more than 5 speakers, we're going to make it 2 minutes. If we have more
Okay.
than 10
Oh,
speakers, we're
ahead
going to
of
make it a
time.
minute. And they just let them know up front.
And I think we've been really good about if folks, all of a sudden want to turn in a card because something piqued their interest or something reminded them, right? I mean, I'm human. We forget things until we hear somebody else say it, right?
Mhm.
That happens to me all the time. And so, but then after a certain time, we say, okay, now there are no more hands raised. Okay, now we have 5 more. So for the next, anybody after this point, we're gonna have to cut it off, or anybody else, it's gonna be a minute, or I think we've been really good about, are there any more, after this last hand is raised, if additional hands go up, please email the board, because you can't keep
Mhm.
going on and on and on until there are no more hands raised, because there's no more hands raised, but then a few minutes later, you'll see 5 hands go up.
Yeah. Well, in public comment, when public comment is closed, I
Uh-huh.
would encourage you to keep public comment closed. Because again, you get into this thing with somebody, oh, I was going to say something and you close public comment, or the board just said something and now I have this idea. It's your meeting. You need to get your business done.
As president, usually we make the announcement that you have to do it in advance of the item that's going on. Right?
Do what in
So-
advance, sorry?
So the blue cards,
Okay.
the speaker
Mhm.
cards have to be in at the beginning of the agenda item,
Uh-huh.
not in the moment.
Not
of.
in
But
the
in
moment,
our
yeah.
meetings, when it's
It
been
has to be-
contentious,
yeah.
people will.
We've
turn
allowed
up
for
and-
it,
We
but
allow
again,
for it,
but here's the thing. When we clearly state you need to get it in before the agenda item, it's
Mhm.
there. We say it multiple times
Yeah,
in a meeting, always at the beginning of the meeting. I remember because I have to read the dang
Yeah.
thing. So, I mean, so I
Yeah.
remember. So we do have that,
Yeah.
Mhm.
and we do cut it. But what I worried about is, yes, that happens with the speaker cards, but then when we're going online, people just start
Yeah.
raising their hands and on and on
It
and on
normally
and on.
happens when we have the non-agendized at the beginning, we have that's where we have the 20 or 30 comments. That's
But what I'm saying is with the agenda items, we do that with the speaker cards and we usually don't add to the end, like you're saying, it's like they keep running up.
then maybe we should.
But
add
what
that in
happens
there.
on
Mhm.
virtual
Mhm.
is people can raise their hands at any time. And like at the last minute, they can raise their hand. So it doesn't seem fair that if you're in person, you're being restricted because you don't have your speaker card in. But if you're online, you can just raise your hand at any moment and you'll be called on.
Or what you could do, which some districts do, is say, when you get to that item, last call for speaker cards. And if you want to speak to this item online, please raise your hand now. If your hand is not raised by the end of this announcement, you treat it as if you've not gotten in a.
That's my
speaker card.
that's what a great suggestion that I think we should do.
And again, as long as you apply it consistently
Consistently.
and
Uh-huh.
evenly.
Yeah.
And I mean, I also know a lot of districts that have gotten rid of doing anything online because of these issues.
Yeah,
And so, that's something everybody has to think about. Yeah, exactly.
well, but access, because there's folks that cannot be here, so.
Yeah. Well, and the spirit of the Brown Act is to have open meetings. So one can argue that the spirit of the Brown Act really is, you should be,
Yeah,
doing this. The compromise is there are still districts out there now who are allowing people to watch online, but not to speak
To
online
comment,
because it's
yeah.
so hard to control. And the Zoom bombings and all of the other things that went on. So all things for you to think about when you have more time.
And then I have a quick question. Do
Yeah.
you, one of our board bylaw, I don't know if we should review that and make some edits. It does mention that, of course, the board president may adjust the speaker's time from the 3 minutes, but it says comma with board consent. So maybe we should revisit that because it sounds like, hey, we have 30 more cards than we thought we had. I think maybe we just say something simple like, maybe the board president says, hey, I want to reduce the time. Does everybody agree? And we just say yes. Or maybe we change the board bylaw because the board bylaw says the board president with board consent may adjust the time.
Yeah.
Each speaker from the 3 minutes.
so
Well-
I'm sorry, just to be mindful
Uh-huh.
of the time, it's
Yeah.
6:35 and we're on the 16th slide
Mhm.
out of 56, so.
I'm gonna have to go
Sorry.
soon, just so you know. I'm sorry, but I only can stay.
But
for-
trustee Chavez, I can bring the board, I think it's a good
Sure.
idea to review
Yeah.
that board bylaw and I can bring it back. Yeah.
Thank you.
And just so we know where we are, my goal was by 6:30 to be on to the second part. because we're spending a lot more time on the Brown Act intentionally than we are on the rules of procedure.
Okay.
And there's a lot of slides there for a reason, because I gave you graphics there.
Thank you.
So that will go faster. But
Okay, thanks.
I am going to wrap up the Brown Act piece of this. So we already talked about responding to public comments earlier, so I'm not going to get into that again. Closed session, just to reiterate, everything has to be on open session unless you fall within a statutory exception that allows you to go into closed session. And this is another thing people don't understand, because they'll say, oh, this is a sensitive topic. Let's go into closed session. You got to fit within one of the closed session criteria. And I've listed some of the main ones here. This is not exhaustive, that we see come up a lot. And the reason I listed this is so that you understand, like, why would you not have real property negotiations in open session? Why would you not have labor negotiations in open session? Because you're giving away all your strategy, right? There's reasons for you to do it. Why can you talk about an employee in closed session? Privacy issues, right? So there's a reason for all of these. Federal law requires that you consider student issues in closed session when it deals with particular students. And sometimes people say, well, where does it say that in the Brown Act? The answer is it doesn't. Federal law overrules state law. So you have to worry about that as well. And there are specific ways that you have to agendize things for closed session. You have to at least come close to the safe harbor language that's laid out in the Brown Act. So it's important for the board to understand there are times you can't go into closed session. It's just, we can't get you there. We can't come up with a way to do it. And one of the big ones to think about is potential litigation. So there's all kinds of rules, and people always want to say, well, somebody might sue us over that, so let's go into closed session. You're supposed to really be faced with facts and circumstances where there's either an actual threat of litigation or a real possibility that litigation will occur before you go into the closed session. And there's particular ways to agendize all of that. And when you come out, you're supposed to clearly identify the vote that was taken in closed session. This changed with that law from a few years ago about votes. You can't come out and say it was a 4-1 vote. You have to say it was a 4-1 vote with these 4 board members voting yes and 1 board member no. If it's unanimous, you can say it's unanimous. If it's unanimous, but trustee X was absent, you can say that. But you have to have a clear record when you come out of that closed session of the action taken. Yeah, sure.
They give a question with that. So when I put a 5-0 vote, that's unanimous in our board, but our minutes always reflect each board member's vote. It's recorded. Is that the correct way?
That is definitely the correct way to do it. The more you can make clear exactly how people voted, the more you are in compliance. And that's what you want to stay focused on. There are times that you can delay reporting something out. The classic example is the board approved a settlement, but the other side in the potential litigation or litigation hasn't yet. You can wait to report out until after the other side approves it. There's other examples along the way, but one question you can always ask, which is always helpful, and I love it when board members ask this as they're leaving closed session, before we leave closed session, is there anything we need to report out? You just check each other so that you can have that conversation, because sometimes we forget and something doesn't get reported out.
Yeah.
Or you're not realizing something's going to get reported out, and then you panic when suddenly you hear the board president reporting it out. So having that clarity at the end of closed session is a good idea. Maintaining closed session confidentiality. I'm not going to go into this in detail. The main point to tell you is that if you hear it in closed session, like Las Vegas, it stays in closed session. It is actually a violation of law to talk about what happened in closed session out of closed session. And there are potential ramifications if somebody accuses you of sharing information from closed session in any way that is to your personal gain, your pecuniary gain, which is really monetary, but it can go beyond just pure money. You have committed a crime. You can go to jail for that. So my wife knows when I come home from a board meeting and I say, that was a crazy meeting. And she said, what happened? And I say, it was in closed session. She doesn't ask again because I can't share what happened in closed session other than maybe telling her it was a crazy meeting. So really important to keep confidential matters confidential, and your board policy reflects that as well. And with all of this on the Brown Act, I told you up front, really important to comply with the Brown Act so that you are not giving people reasons to attack things that you're doing, to try to undo actions. Because one of the things somebody can do is actually go to court and overturn an action you took. There's process they have to follow. They have to give you a chance to cure it first. You don't want to give that to them. But beyond that, If it can be shown that your violation of the Brown Act was intentional, that is also a crime for which you can be fined or go to jail. Now, the good news is California jails are not full of people who violated the Brown Act and therefore went to jail, but there are some. The classic one being out of San Diego area, the South Bay scandal that happened years back, where you actually had contractors exchanging bags of cash with board members in dark alleys. And they were doing it not only violating those laws, they were also violating the Brown Act because 3 of them were coordinating with each other. And we have a board member who was criminally convicted for that from one of the school districts. And we have a superintendent who was criminally convicted for that. So you're not going to do any of that. But because that's out there, if somebody sees you violated the Brown Act, they may ask the question, was that intentional? Even though it wasn't intentional. And then the DA gets involved and bad things happen and you don't want to go through that. And I've dealt multiple times over the years with criminal accusations of the Brown Act. Fortunately, every time we were able to persuade the district attorney's office, it wasn't intentional. It was an inadvertent violation, or it really wasn't a violation at all. So this is the part where I scare you. Be really careful with these Brown Act issues. What I'm going to do with the remainder of the time, oh, and just one last thing, because I don't want to leave this out because it's a newer law. There are these new laws on remote attendance, and I want to make sure that you're aware of them. The rule used to be if you can't be at the board meeting in person, that the district has to put on the agenda where you're going to be located, and you can call in or Zoom in from another location, and you have to post at your other location, and people who come there actually are allowed to come into your hotel room, to your house, wherever it is. That's the standard rule that's still there. But now there's these 2 additional exceptions, the just cause exception and individual emergency circumstances. Just cause, twice a year, each board member, and poor Shar has to keep track of all of this, has 2 times a year to take an automatic, I can't be there in person, I'm going to Zoom in or I'm going to do it by telephone for just cause. The purpose of just cause is family care, child care, you have contagious illness, you're on official district business, which is probably not going to sound at all of you traveling places, but it's a freebie. The board, you ask for it, the board gives it to you. You are allowed to do it, and you don't have to have your location posted, and you don't have to have members of the public allowed to come in. So it's 2 freebies per year, but again, you're really only supposed to do it if it's for these kinds of purposes. You also have now a personal emergency, which is, oh my gosh, something happened. I have a family emergency, I have a work emergency, it's a personal emergency, I cannot get to the board meeting. For those, you can do that as well. You're supposed to get board approval for it. So you have to pop up on the Zoom and say, I have an emergency, here's what my emergency is, and then the board gets to vote on whether or not you're allowed to attend. Yes. So I just wanted to make sure people were aware of that. You can only use that exception for 20% of the meetings through a year. So the 2 exceptions together, you can't do it per board member more than 20% of the time. So what we often get is, oh my gosh, I'm running late. I want to call in from my car. That's probably not going to fit within these exceptions, as opposed to I got COVID and I'm stuck at home. That's probably going to fit within these kinds of exceptions. So with that, I'm going to do the quick round on board meeting procedures. The Roberts Rules of Order is like the most boring thing in the world. And I had one board that wanted me to come do a 2-hour presentation for them on Roberts Rules of Order. And I refused. I told them I wouldn't do that to them. I did it in an hour. We're going to do it for you in 15 minutes because there's a ton of rules within Roberts Rules of Order. And I talked to Shar in preparing for this. Your board follows Roberts Rules of Order, although interestingly, it does not say that anywhere that I can find in policy. You're like many districts that just informally decided to do it. Someday you might want to revisit that. There's an alternative. There are alternative rules of order. One of them is called Rosenberg's Rules of Order. And what Rosenberg is Robert's Rules of Order were written in like 1870 something. There were a former Union soldier officer who wrote them, and he based them on the US Congress. And they're still the rules we're using today. Rosenberg, not that long ago, I think in the 90s, was a judge who had also been a city council member, took all those rules and condensed them to about 10 pages and simplified and streamlined the rules. So I'm not asking you to make a decision on that tonight, but just to put on your radar. I don't know anybody who knows all of Robert's Rules of Order because it's 300 and something pages. I know a lot of people who know all of Rosenberg's rules, and they're plain English and they're straightforward. So They don't, so Rosenberg's rules really intended to condense and simplify Robert's rules. There are some differences in the rules. So for example, Robert's Rules of Order, you cannot take a motion and move it forward unless, excuse me, a second in almost every instance. Rosenberg said you don't even need a second. So he really streamlined things. Now, you could also do what Albany Unified School District did, which is they adopted their own rules of procedure. They took Rosenberg's and they tweaked it and they made it their own set of rules. But this is important because every now and then in your existence, some procedural issue is going to come up and you're all going to be looking at each other and trying really hard to figure out what to do. And unless you are one of the districts that has a parliamentarian that sits with the school board, and those exist in some larger urban districts, I feel so bad for them, where they actually just have somebody who rules on it on the spot, you're not going to know all of it. And so I'm here to tell you that on all of these board meeting procedures, here's a Harold's Rule of Order, which is if you're spending more time talking about process than substance, you have a problem. And what ends up happening sometimes is you get stuck on, well, how do we do this procedurally? Work together, work with your board president, find what works for you and get through it so you can get to the substance. If you're just dealing with the procedural parts, you are mired in what is probably dysfunction. And so you really have to do this carefully. But I did want to make you aware of a few things with Robert's Rules of Order. So Robert's Rules of Order or procedural rules generally are to help you have an orderly meeting. They're not to be weaponized. They're not to use against each other. They're not to stop progress. They're to keep the meeting moving in an orderly way. Robert's Rules of Order, again, were generally intended to provide this process. And I talked to you about the alternative that's out there with Rosenberg's rules. But what we did with Robert's Rules, this is something that our firm put together to try to explain what Robert's Rules says is the order, just visually, the order that you do things in a board meeting. And you're almost certainly going to tell me you don't do it this way, because I know very few school districts that do it this way. So are you really following Robert's Rules of Order? And it's okay, but this is the order, and I'm going to take you through them piece by piece quickly. And I'll just tell you, if you count down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you'll see there's the main motion is made, and then the second is made, and then only after all of that do you discuss and debate. Whereas almost every school district does the motion after all of the discussion has taken place. And the issue with that, the reason Robert's Rules of Order doesn't do it that way, is what if there wasn't even a second? What if there was no interest in moving forward? You've just spent an hour discussing something and then it fizzles, as opposed to finding up front, do you have two people who are actually interested in continuing the conversation? Person who made the motion and the second. So something for you to think about. And again, I'm going to take you through these. So the first thing you do is you announce the agenda item. It's probably done in your meeting. We're on item X and we're now going on item Y and we're now going through that. And here's what it says. Typically, then there's a report on the item. That report is typically from your staff. Staff gets up, they make the report. And then the next thing that happens after the staff does this, you often want to get a recommendation from staff as part of that. I go to some school board meetings, and again, I work with a lot of school districts where staff is almost forgotten and they never get their recommendation in. And the board votes on things and then finds out later that there were reasons staff was really concerned about it. And so give them that time to give you their input. The next thing that happens is clarifying questions. This is, again, if you follow the Brown Act or the Robert's Rules of Order, clarifying questions.
Can I just jump in on prior to that? So one of the things we typically do, not always, but typically do is on the board memo, we'll put the staff recommendation at the bottom. So it'll say recommendation. Sometimes it's just review and discuss. Sometimes it's take action, and the superintendent or district staff recommends that the board adopts blah, 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 blah.
Right.
So that it's there for the public to see even before the meeting. You know, we post the agenda obviously before, for the public and the board to see what our recommendation is ahead of the discussion. Now it's up to you to make a motion, second it, all those kinds of things. Agree or disagree, but it's important that you know our recommendation. And sometimes, and this was back in my previous district, the board would want me to bring something forward that I didn't recommend. Like, I don't think the board should go that direction. And so on the board memo, I would write, superintendent does not recommend that the board approves this initiative or whatever it is, because it was an initiative brought forward by a particular board member or a particular community member that the board wanted to listen in on. And so I wanted to make my stance known. And that doesn't mean the board agrees with it. Sometimes the board would still do it, but I had on record what my professional recommendation was.
Mhm.
Yeah, and you have a good practice in this district, and a number of districts do this, where you have a rich agenda item. It's
Mhm.
not just a one sentence statement of what it is with no recommendation and no background. And I've helped write some of those. I mean, I think it's really good that you lay it out the way that you do. So now you have your recommendation. The next step under Robert's Rules of Order is clarifying questions. This is not questions from the audience. This is questions from the board, and they're directed to your staff member, and they are clarifying questions. That's what Roberts intends. Can you help me understand this? I need a little more information on that. You made this point. It is not the time for advocacy, and it is not the time for 5 people to beat up on one who's at the podium. It's really just, what do you need? What more information do you need to be able to make a decision? And that's, again, districts go sideways because they'll ask for clarifying questions. They instead have debate. And then later, what do? They have debate again. And now you've doubled the length of the time that you're discussing this. So you have your clarifying questions. The next step is public comment. So the concept here is that the public has now heard the staff's recommendation. They understand what the agenda item is. They've heard clarifying questions from the board. They get to share with the board their thoughts on this. Sometimes they'll come up and they'll ask clarifying questions. That's not necessarily how it works. The clarifying questions came from the board. And you have your public comment, which we've talked about a great deal. So what Robert's Rules then intends is the next thing that happens is somebody makes a motion. It's what Robert's Rule calls the main motion. You know, I move that we approve resolution number X, Y, and Z. And it's interesting because you have that motion. The motion can come in a number of different forms, and we've spelled it out here. So member makes the motion, another member seconds the motion. And I say here, it's not always required. That's if you're a Rosenberg's Rule district, but really the only time we don't get a second where we look for one is when it's a point of privilege. When somebody says, the room's too hot, point of privilege, the room's too hot, can we lower it? You don't need a second to do that, right? So usually you're going to require a second under almost everything for Robert's Rules of Order. The reason being, if you only have one board member who wants to discuss something, it probably is not going to be worth having the motion go forward. It's probably not going to be something that's going to be an action that's taken. So you try to see that there's at least 2 people who are interested in it. Again, the board member who makes the motion, they are supposed to obtain the floor first. So what does that mean? You're supposed to be recognized before you speak as a board member and make the motion. I work with one school district that has, and they've got this out of a book that we all read. They have a little piece of linoleum tile floor, and you have to be holding that piece of linoleum tile floor to be recognized as the speaker. And they did it because they kept talking over each other. And after a couple months of having this little piece of floor, they got the point and they stopped interrupting each other.
The talking
So-
stick.
Yeah, talking stick. I worked with another district that used the talking stick. So when we talk about a motion, there's different kinds of motions. There's the main motion, and we gave an example here. I move that we create a 5-member committee to plan and put on our annual fundraiser. That's what's on the agenda. These are examples actually from Rosenberg's Rules. So I've put forward the basic motion that's what we're going to be talking about. Somebody can make a motion to amend. I'm going to take the basic motion that we have, and I move that we amend that motion. So you had this first motion, there was a second, it's now on the floor. Somebody says, well, I move that we amend that motion. So instead of having a 5-member committee, we have a 10-member committee. And at that point, if somebody seconds that and the board votes, you've now amended the motion so that we have a new motion on the floor. It's really cumbersome, right? So what do you do in practice? What you usually do, it's talked about in Rosenberg's Rules, is you ask for a friendly amendment. Somebody says to the person who made the motion, you said 5, would you be open to changing your motion to say 10? And if they do, that shortcuts a lot. And there's a third kind of motion, which is a substitute motion. Don't do these. I highly recommend against them. Which is, I don't like the motion you made, and instead of voting against it, I'm going to move that we make a substitute motion to do the opposite of what you said. That is allowable to you under Robert's Rules of Order, and it's another very visible sign of dysfunction. If you oppose what they're doing, oppose it. Don't try to substitute in a motion. There are times that the reason for the substitute motion is that the motion was not well conceived. And in talking about it, it's like, maybe we'd be better off with this, but usually you can go back to the person who made the motion. So these are these different kinds of motions.
When you make the motion, do you have to read out the whole title of the thing, or can you just say, I move to approve? Or I move to approve the agenda item? Or do you
Yeah.
have to like say the whole thing?
I think it's fine. Say, I move that we approve resolution number blah, 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 and not read the whole title. Or I move that we approve item, 10 on the agenda.
Okay.
I don't think you always have to read off the whole thing. And the minutes are going to reflect clearly
Mhm.
what the board did. I work with some districts that insist on reading for the motion the entirety of it every time. It just takes up a lot of time.
Mhm.
The key is it clear? If it's clear from what you're saying, you're fine. So next step is second the motion. If the motion isn't seconded, it's over. The item didn't pass, you move on. The next step, which is interesting in Robert's rules, is you understand the motion. Understanding the motion basically involves the board president looking everybody and saying, you got it? In Congress, they would read the whole thing again, which again gets really cumbersome. So now, only after you've had the staff report, public input, the motion's been made, and there's a second, under Robert's rules, do you now go to discussion and debate? And why is that? Why do you wait until then? The notion is you wait until the board has heard everything from everybody other than the other board members. You've heard from the audience, you've heard from staff, you got everything clarified. Now you're ready to have the discussion. And doing it in this order actually helps make sure you only have one discussion period and it doesn't keep reopening. But most districts don't do it this way. Most districts have discussion and then make the motion. Nothing wrong with that. Just be aware that's not literally what Robert's rules say. So once everything is formally in front of the board, something happens procedurally, which is it's too late for the person that made the motion to withdraw the motion. At any point up until you're at this discussion point, the person who made the motion can just withdraw it. You can say, I don't think this is the right thing to do tonight. I'm going to withdraw the motion. The reason for this is you're not going to then have to have discussion if the motion's withdrawn and nobody else makes it. This is all to keep your meeting moving. Once the discussion starts, you don't allow the person to withdraw the motion for the same reason, because then you're going to get halfway through discussion and it's going to get withdrawn and you're going to keep going. So procedurally, just something to be aware of. I put up some non-debatable motions. These are, again, I'm not going to belabor this, just so that you're aware of. There are some things that you can do where there is no debate. You make the motion, there's a vote on it, and that's it. One of them is I move we adjourn. I'm done. I move we adjourn. That obviously doesn't usually come up until the end of the meeting. One of them is a motion to recess. And this is a great tool if you have a meeting that's gotten really heated and the board president may be struggling to keep control. As another board member, you can help them sometimes by saying, I move that we move to a 5-minute recess. That immediately goes to a vote of the board. You vote that there's going to be a recess. You all get to have the point down. You do still have a second with these, but you don't have debate. It's just you do it. It's just boom. Motion to fix time to adjourn. Don't worry about that. You'll never do it. Motion to table an item. If an item's going long and the board really feels like, or a board member feels like we're not going to get there tonight, we have more important business, they can make a motion to table. Where things go sideways is then debate incurs about should we table it or not. The person makes the motion, you vote on it. If it passes, you're done with that item for the night. If it doesn't pass, you go back to debating it. You don't spend 20 minutes debating whether you're going to table it or not. And then motion to limit debate. If you've been having a board discussion that's going on and on and on, and a board member feels like, I think everybody's got their position, they can just, I move to limit the debate. Another way to say it is I call the question. And then the board by a 2/3 vote can just cut off discussion and boom, you're off and running. You're going to vote. You're not going to have any more discussion. So just a way to rein in things when they go too long. I'm not going to talk to you about handling multiple motions because as you can tell from this, it's really complicated. There's privileged motions, there's incidental motions, there's all these different kinds of motions. The main thing to be aware of is that when you're going through this, generally speaking, you start with a motion, somebody may make a motion to amend, They may make a motion to substitute. The general rule is you work forwards and then backwards. You take the last motion that was on the floor, you deal with that, and you go back to the one that was before it, and the one that was before it, until you get ultimately back to the main motion. Hopefully, this is not what your meetings are like. Hopefully, you're not doing, amendments and going through all of this, which is why I'm not going to belabor this. The key is to always get back to what is it that we're voting on. And you can always just talk to each other. Can you clarify your motion? I'm not understanding what this means, as opposed to bringing a motion to amend it. And then you take the vote. You finally got there. And when you take the vote, you take a vote by asking for ayes or nays, or if you want to be more modern, you can do yes or no, abstentions. Unless there's a supermajority requirement, it's really easy for school districts. You have 5 board members, it takes 3 to pass something. There's 4 board members at the meeting, it takes 3 to pass it. There's 3 board members at the meeting, it takes 3 to pass it. That is different from other local agencies. And that's another education code requirement. For city council, if they only had 4 people show up and it's a 2-2 vote, the motion passes. You can't do that. That does not exist for school districts. And it's important for you to know that, because you'll get people who don't understand that in the audience because they've been to the city council meeting. And so why didn't that motion pass? It was 2-1. It should have passed. Well, if it was city council, it would have. But here it was 2-1 with 2 abstentions or 2 absent, didn't pass. So that is a difference to be aware of. And then the last thing you do is you announce the result, which seems duplicative, but it actually is a really good practice to say, by a vote of 3-2 with board member X voting this way or board member Y voting that way, motion passes, resolution blah, blah, blah is adopted. Yeah.
Just to make sure I understand, so to pass, it has to have, for our board, it has to have 3.
Has to have 3
2/3
votes
vote.
for everything. And an abstention does not count as a yes vote, as it does for other kinds of public agencies. It's always got to be 3 people affirmatively voting yes, unless there's certain things that take a 2/3 majority.
Okay.
Yeah.
One that we did with you, which Yancy is well aware of, is when you decided to sell the Crestmore site. That takes a 2/3 vote just by
Yeah.
statute. So 5-member board, you have to have 4 yes votes.
Okay.
Um,
Thank you.
And usually it's the default is 3. And I've been at board meetings where we get into huge debates about how do abstentions count, and Rosenberg's rule says this and this. And I'm sitting there just telling them over and over again, the education code says you have to have 3 people. So all of these debates are very interesting, but it's easier for a school district easily. It's just those 3 votes. So we get through that process. You announce what the result was. The minutes are supposed to clearly reflect what that is. There is one kind of motion, and I know we need to wrap up, that I just wanted to touch on a couple things. Motions to reconsider. This comes up more than I want it to come up, where a decision is made and somebody wants it to be reconsidered down the road. And there are very specific rules under Robert's Rules of Order. And this is the one place where I will tell you, be sticklers for process. Because the reason for this rule is if you don't do it, somebody who loses a vote, they were the 4-1 vote, they were the one, may be bringing this back to the board every meeting for the rest of your lives. There has to be finality at some point. So the rules of Robert's Rule are, if you want a motion for reconsideration, I move that we reconsider that item. It has to be the same board meeting. It has to happen at the same board meeting. We've had that happen where somebody realized, I didn't understand that I mentioned it earlier, my yes vote, I thought the way it was worded that I was voting no. You have me voting yes. I'd like to move to reconsider. The board can suspend its rules by a 2/3 vote and allow an item to come back at a later meeting and be put back on an agenda. We usually try to agendize that that's all coming, so it's clearly in compliance with the Brown Act. And the other thing with the motion to reconsider is it has to be made by somebody who voted it says it right there, can be seconded by any board member, but may be made only by a member who voted in the majority on the original motion. So if you had a 3-2 vote on something, it has to be one of those 3 people that makes the motion to reconsider that vote. Anybody can second it. But what is the reason for that? It's again, so the person who lost the vote isn't constantly bringing it back again and again and again. We have had instances over the years where circumstances changed on something, and the board, because circumstances changed, the board really did want to revisit it and maybe reconsider what they wanted to do. So they'll suspend their rules to allow them to bring that at a future date, and they'll have the motion for reconsideration. So it's a legitimate thing that you will use. This is something, check with your lawyer, on how to do that right. Because you want to make sure if you took some action that you're undoing it the right way. And so I wanted to just belabor that for a minute. A few additional motions just to be aware of. You don't have to be this formal, just use plain English. If the room's too hot, say, excuse me, I'm having trouble hearing, or the room's too hot. You don't have to say point of privilege. Point of order is one I do like. Point of order is, I think we're doing something wrong procedurally. So I'm making a point of order. That you can interrupt somebody for these. You can interrupt, say, a point of order. I don't think this is on the agenda. I think we've gone off the agenda. You can help each other. One other one I wanted to mention here is the appeal. Under Robert's Rules of Order, if the board president makes a decision and the rest of the board doesn't agree with it, you can actually appeal it and the majority of the board can reverse it. So if, I'm going to give you an example, somebody's speaking at the podium and the board president says, I'm sorry, that's not within our jurisdiction, so I'm cutting you off. And another board member says, actually, I think it is in our jurisdiction. And so I move that we reconsider that, or I appeal that decision. The board can decide then and there whether to allow it. I'm going to recommend you never do that. I'm calling it to your attention so you're aware of the process. Just have the discussion. Use plain English. It's okay. You don't have to be as formal as it is here. Motions to suspend the rules I talked about takes a 2/3 vote. So if you want to bring something back, you can vote by 2/3 to do that. And I've gone 8 minutes over, so I'm going to stop.
Fine.
Yeah.
This happened on a prior board that I was part of. So just picture something, there was a 3-2 vote. And just like you said, Harold, the two folks who were in the minority of the board decision as a whole wanted to keep bringing something back. But we were always, we dug into the Robert's Rules of Orders, and just like you explained, it needs to be from somebody who was in the majority who says, all right, let's bring it back at a future meeting, right? This was months went, well, it's not the same meeting, it was months later. But I noticed what you had written here or highlighted is that it needs to be in the same meeting. What if something happens and then 3 months later, somebody says, you know what, I will bring that back. And it needs to be one of those 3 people that were in the, whether it's 3 or 4, it needs to be somebody from the majority and not somebody in the minority. But can it be brought back in a future meeting?
Yeah,
Does
so
it need to be the same meeting?
What that board member would do is go to your agenda setting team, your board president, your superintendent, and say, I would like an agenda. I would like this to come back as a motion to reconsider, which also means you have to put on the agenda a vote on whether to suspend your rules. And then you have 2 actions on that agenda. One is motion to suspend rules to allow for X. And then the second is you put that on motion for reconsideration. And so it's not a surprise thing. It's not something you do at the meeting out of the blue. It's something that gets set as part of that agenda setting process.
But it would all, but that person who brings it back has to be one of the folks that was in the majority
Although
originally.
somebody was not in the majority, can ask the board to suspend the rules to allow them to be the one to make the motion. So there's still a way to get it back there again. And I worked with one district where that got abused terribly. And the person kept getting put on the agenda to be allowed to suspend the rules to allow the person in the minority to bring it. So they actually revised their policy to make it a one-off. That somebody in the minority can ask one time to suspend the rules on it. And then after that, they can't anymore. That's the beauty of these rules, is if you find something that's not working for you, adjust your rules. You know, you can adopt your own process. You don't have to just follow Robert's rules or Rosenberg's rules.
Thank you very, very much. Did all of the trustees and everybody get their questions answered? Great. Okay, we need to move on to public comment. If you're joining us in person and wish to make a comment about the agenda item, please fill out a request to address the board form and submit it to the secretary. This form should be given to the secretary before the agenda item begins. If you are joining us virtually, use the raise hand feature on Zoom to be recognized. When invited to do so, your camera must be on before you are called upon to make a public comment. We will call on you to begin your comment once we have promoted you into the meeting. If your camera is not operational, please email your comments to the Board of Trustees at board, BOARD, at SMUHSD.org. Please note that the comments are limited to 3 minutes. The board president may increase or decrease the time allowed for public comment, depending upon the topic and number of persons wishing to be heard. I will call on in-person comments first. Do we have any in-person comments?
There are none, President Andrade Zuniga.
Thank you. How about any on Zoom?
There are none.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Aquino. All right, well, we will move to adjourn. Thank you.